The voicemail came through at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, and I almost didn't listen to it. My phone had been sitting on the kitchen counter, face down, buzzing like it does these days with notifications and alerts I barely pay attention to anymore. I was standing there in the dark, just the refrigerator hum and the distant sound of traffic outside my apartment, one hand on a glass of water I wasn't really drinking, staring out the window at the street below where a couple was walking, laughing, holding hands. Something about that moment, seeing other people's happiness through glass, made me pick up the phone. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe after 13 years of silence, some part of me was still waiting for her voice, even though I'd trained myself not to hope for anything anymore. The message was from a number I didn't recognise, no caller ID, just flagged as voicemail. I almost deleted it. I reached toward the delete button and my thumb actually hovered there for a second, and then something stopped me. I pressed play instead, and there she was, my wife, my dead wife. After 13 years, I was hearing her voice in my kitchen at midnight on a random Tuesday, like it was the most normal thing in the world. "Honey, it's me," the message began, and my knees actually went weak, and I had to reach out and grab the kitchen counter to steady myself. Her voice was exactly like I remembered it, that slight rasp in the lower register, the way she always slowed down at the end of sentences like she was giving you time to process what she'd just said. "I'm okay. I need you to know that I'm okay. I know you've been carrying this, all this pain, but you need to let me go. You need to let it go. I'm waiting for you, but not today. Not yet. But soon." The message cut off abruptly. No goodbye, no explanation, no timestamp on the voicemail itself, just her voice and then silence. I must have played it back 50 times in the next hour, each time less certain that I'd actually heard it, each time more certain that I was losing my mind, and by the time I finally put the phone down at 1 a.m, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it. "My name is David Chen, and my wife was Sarah Chen." Was. That word never got easier. We met at university in the environmental office. I'd stumbled in looking for a friend, and there she was, sitting at a desk covered in pamphlets and maps of local wetlands, talking passionately about preserving habitat corridors. She wore a green cardigan, and I remember thinking that intensity in her eyes made her believe she could actually save the world. We fell in love the way you do when you're young, and everything seemed like it's going to last forever. She was studying environmental science, already knew exactly what she wanted to do with her life. I was a journalism student still figuring out who I was, and she seemed so certain about everything. We got married at 26, bought a house on Maple Street, a little bungalow with a yard and basement where Sarah planned to start a garden. She had sketches of it, detailed drawings showing where everything would go. We'd been married for 6 years when she died. 6 years, not nearly enough time. March 14th, 2011, a Friday. A date that split my life into before and after. She was supposed to be home by 6 p.m, working at the environmental consulting firm where she'd built her career. I was working late, covering a shift at the newspaper. Nothing different about that day, nothing that stood out. She texted around 2 p.m. saying she'd stop by the house to grab paperwork for a client meeting. I told her I'd meet her for dinner at 7 at our favourite Thai place. I remember making the reservation, remember thinking about what I'd order. That was the last communication we ever had. A text exchange about dinner plans, that's how it ended. The fire started around 3:30 in the afternoon. An electrical problem in the walls, the investigators said. Old wiring that had deteriorated over years. The house was built in 1962, and we'd talked about updating the systems but kept putting it off. The investigation was thorough. They tracked the fire's progression, a short circuit in the bedroom wall, probably building for months. No accelerant, no signs of anything suspicious, just old infrastructure failing. Sarah was the only one home. Neighbours called 911 when they saw smoke, but by the time the fire department arrived, the entire front section was engulfed in flames that consumed everything. Sarah was found in the master bedroom, our bedroom. The official determination was that she tried to escape, got confused by the smoke. She suffocated before the flames reached her. That's what they told me at the hospital. That's what the death certificate says. That's what I've told myself for 13 years, playing it out in my head 1,000 times, imagining her last moments trying to find some small mercy in the chaos of it all. There's no mercy in fire, just heat and terror and the smell that burned itself into my memories so completely that I can't smell wood smoke anymore without feeling like I'm drowning. The years after her death moved like they were stuck in amber. Time didn't flow normally. It just accumulated day after day, heavy and inert. I realised after 6 months that I wasn't healing, I wasn't moving through the stages of grief everyone talked about. I was just existing in suspension, waiting for her to walk through the door, waiting for the phone to ring and hear her voice. I kept working at the newspaper because work was what I knew how to do. I'd show up and write stories about city council meetings and crime, everything that mattered to people and nothing to me. I moved through it like I was reading lines someone else had written. My family tried to help, and I hated them for it, and I hated myself for hating them. My parents came over constantly for the first few months, bringing casseroles and offering to stay with me, trying so hard to say the right things, and I'd watch them struggle to find words that could possibly fit the situation. My sister called every day, worried I was going to do something drastic, and I kept telling her I was fine even though we both knew that I wasn't. That fine was a word that had lost all meaning. I just existed in this hollow state where I woke up, went to work, came home to the apartment I'd rented because I couldn't bear to stay in that house anymore, and I waited for sleep to come again. Sleep was the only place that made sense. In sleep, Sarah was still alive. In sleep, it was Essie, till the night before the fire. About 2 years after Sarah died, I met someone at a work event, one of those tedious fundraisers where the local media mingles with business leaders and pretends to care about community development. Her name was Lisa. She was nice and kind, and she had a laugh that didn't sound sad, and somehow that made me think maybe I could learn to be around people again. We dated for maybe 8 months. We went out to dinner, we went to movies, we did all the things that dating people do, and halfway through the 3rd month, I realised I was just using her to fill the space where Sarah used to be, using her as a placeholder, a substitute for the person I actually wanted to talk to. She could feel it, I think. Women always can. Eventually I ended it and Lisa cried, and I felt like a monster because I couldn't cry with her, couldn't feel the right things at the right times anymore. I just sat there and felt nothing, and she said I was broken in a way she didn't know how to fix. She was right. After that, I mostly stayed alone. It was easier that way. No pretense, no one asking me if I was okay. Which was the question I hated more than any other because the answer was complicated and it never changed no matter what I tried. I got promoted to senior reporter in 2015, 5 years after Sarah died. The promotion came with more money and better assignments, the kind of work I should have been excited about. But it felt like someone was controlling me remotely, like I was a puppet working through the motions, responding to stimulus without actually being present. I wrote good stories, I won some awards. A piece I did on municipal corruption got picked up by the wire services and led to actual investigations, actual consequences for people. That should have meant something to me. That should have felt like something approximating success or purpose or achievement. But it all felt hollow. None of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was that Sarah was gone, and I was still here, and that inequality seemed like a cosmic joke that I was too stupid to understand the punchline to. I would see her name pop up in my phone sometimes when I was scrolling, still saved in my contacts, still there in my life except in every way that counted. Whoa. By 2024, 13 years after the fire, I'd settled into a routine so predictable it was almost comfortable. I was living in an apartment now, small one-bedroom place near the river downtown, and I'd built a life that was functional if nothing else. I had colleagues I'd grab lunch with, people I'd known for years who still tried occasionally to set me up with someone, who still seemed to believe that finding another person would somehow fix this fundamental brokenness inside me. I had a therapist, Dr. Reeves, who I saw once a month, a kind woman who'd been seeing me long enough that she didn't even flinch anymore when I talked about grief and trauma and the lingering weight of loss. I had systems for managing the sadness, medication for the depression that would cycle through in regular turns, rituals I performed to keep myself in some kind of equilibrium. On Fridays I went to the same Thai restaurant and ordered the same thing Sarah used to order. On her birthday and the anniversary of the fire, I wrote in a journal, the only journaling I did all year. It wasn't happiness, but it was stability. It was a kind of peace, or at least what passed for peace when you'd been broken for long enough to stop expecting to be put back together, when you'd accepted that this was just how you were going to feel forever. And then came Tuesday night, and the voicemail changed everything. Changed the equilibrium I'd built so carefully, changed the certainty I'd developed about how the world worked, changed everything I'd managed to convince myself was solid and real, and wasn't going to shift beneath my feet anymore. I listened to it again at midnight, in the dark of my kitchen, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone. I listened to it at 1 a.m. sitting on the edge of my bed with the lights off, just the sound of her voice in the darkness, and it felt like she was actually there, standing right in front of me. I listened to it at 2:30 a.m., pacing in circles through my apartment while my heart tried to beat its way out of my chest, tried to escape from my body because it knew something I wasn't ready to know yet. The voice was hers, absolutely and unmistakably hers, not a recording I'd heard before, not something I'd somehow forgotten and was now recovering from memory, not some strange glitch of the mind turning random noise into her voice. This was new. This was her voice saying words she'd never said to me, words about waiting, words about letting go, words about things being complicated where she was, words that made no sense if she was dead, and every sense in the world if she was somehow still out there, still aware, still watching me the way I'd been unable to stop watching for her, unable to let her go. I called the phone company at 7 a.m, before dawn had properly broken, my voice so hoarse from not sleeping that the representative had to ask me to repeat everything twice. I explained that I'd received a voicemail from an unknown number the previous night around 11:47 p.m, and I wanted to know if they could trace it, identify the source, tell me anything about where the call originated. The representative, whose name was Michelle, according to her nameplate that I somehow knew she wore even though I was talking to her over the phone, typed things, the sound of her keyboard clicking through the speaker. She put me on hold, and I listened to hold music that seemed designed to drive people to madness. When she came back, her voice had changed slightly, become more cautious, like she was delivered. Ring bad news. Sir, I'm looking at your account here, and I don't see any incoming calls to your number after 9 p.m. yesterday evening. No missed calls, no voicemail deposits, the system shows nothing. She said it carefully, like she was preparing me for disappointment. I insisted. I told her I had listened to the voicemail a dozen times. It was definitely there. Definitely on my phone. Definitely real. She said sometimes old systems could generate phantom messages, especially if I was holding on to an older phone model, that there were glitches in the software that could create false logs. I told her that was impossible, that I knew the difference between my phone working and my phone malfunctioning, that I wasn't confused, that I wasn't crazy, but I was starting to wonder if maybe I was. She didn't argue further. She just wished me a good day and hung up, and I was left sitting there holding a phone that apparently had no record of a call that I'd definitely received. I didn't go to work. I called in sick around 8 in the morning, which wasn't technically a lie because I felt sick, felt like I was coming apart at the seams, felt like the ground was crumbling beneath me and I was standing on the edge of something I didn't understand. My editor asked if I needed anything, if I wanted them to send someone over. I said no, I just needed to rest. I didn't mention that resting was the last thing I could do, that the idea of closing my eyes felt like drowning. I sat on my bed and I pulled up the voicemail again and I pressed play. Honey, it's me. I'm okay. I need you to know that I'm okay. I know you've been carrying this, all this pain, but you need to let me go. You need to let it go. I'm waiting for you, but not today. Not yet. But soon. Her voice filled my bedroom and I wondered if the neighbours could hear it through the walls, if they could hear her voice in my apartment and think I was listening to recordings of a dead woman. Which I was. Which I absolutely was. That afternoon, I dug through boxes in my closet that I hadn't opened since I'd moved into the apartment 5 years ago. Boxes I'd sealed with packing tape and shoved to the back, hoping that out of sight might eventually become out of mind. But it never did. The boxes contained pieces of my life with Sarah. Photos, letters, the wedding album with that gorgeous shot of us on the steps of City Hall where we'd had the ceremony. I found a voicemail recording that Sarah's mother had made. A cassette tape labelled Sarah's Voice that she'd given me about a month after the funeral, thinking it would help me, thinking that hearing her voice again might provide some kind of comfort or closure or something. I'd listened to it once, maybe twice, and then I'd packed it away, unable to bear it, unable to hear her voice when I was still supposed to be accepting that I'd never hear it again. Now I held the cassette and I tried to remember what was on it, what words Sarah had spoken into that machine so long ago. It was just a message, I think. Something she'd recorded for posterity, or maybe just a random greeting that her mother had converted to tape. I couldn't remember. The details had faded and that seemed wrong, like I should be able to remember every single thing, but grief works like that sometimes. It erases things you need to keep and makes you relive things you'd give anything to forget. I didn't have a cassette player anymore. Hadn't for years. I looked online to see if I could convert it or find someone who could play it back for me, and that's when I realised the truth. The voicemail on my phone didn't match any recording I had. The tone was slightly different. The cadence was different. The acoustic properties were different. But it was still her. It was still unmistakably Sarah, unmistakably the woman I'd loved, the woman who'd burned to death in our house 13 years ago, the woman who was supposed to be gone forever. And she was saying she was okay. She was saying I needed to let her go. She was saying she was waiting for me. She was saying there were things about that day that didn't add up. Things I needed to look into, things that had never been explained. I did what any reasonable person would do. I called my therapist, but her office was closed. I called my sister, and she didn't answer. I called the police and reported it as a possible prank call, but the officer I spoke to seemed skeptical, took down information, told me they'd look into it. I knew they wouldn't. There was nothing to look into. No crime had been committed. Someone had just called me from a number that didn't exist and left a message in the voice of my dead wife that wasn't criminal, that was just inexplicable. It was also just the beginning. The voicemails kept coming, and with them other things started happening. Things I couldn't explain. Things that made me wonder if maybe I was actually losing my mind, if maybe the grief had finally reached critical mass and I was experiencing some kind of psychotic break. By Thursday, I'd received 3 more voicemails. They came at random times, always from the unknown number, always with her voice, always with messages that felt directed specifically at me, at the things I was thinking about, at the pain I'd been carrying. One message said, "I've been trying to reach you for so long. I know it's hard. I know you don't understand." The next one said, "There are things happening here that I need you to know about. Strange things, things that don't make sense in the way the world usually makes sense." And the third said, "He's here too. He keeps asking for you. He wants to talk to you. I don't think I can stop him much longer." The part about someone else being there sent me spiraling into full panic. Sarah had no family on her side of the family who died around the time she did. No one was there with her in the house when the fire started, unless she meant something else. Unless she meant something that existed in the space between rationality and madness, in the place where dead people supposedly gathered, and I was not prepared to go there. I was not prepared to consider that my dead wife was communicating with me from beyond the grave, or from some hospital psych ward being pranked by someone with access to her voice, or from literally anywhere that could explain what was happening. I sat on my bed for 3 hours just staring at my phone, trying to make sense of it. I called an old friend, Marcus, who'd been Sarah's colleague at the consulting firm, someone she'd worked with for years and trusted. We hadn't talked in probably 8 years, but I found his number in my contacts and I called him, and he answered surprisingly quickly, like maybe he'd been thinking about me. I met him for coffee on Friday morning at a little place we used to go to sometimes when the 3 of us would hang out after work. I played him the voicemails on my phone, watching his face carefully to see if he recognized the voice, if he could tell me I was crazy, or if he'd validate that yes, that was definitely Sarah, but he was hearing it now, not in the past. Marcus listened to all of them without interrupting, his expression getting darker with each message. When the last one ended, he set down his coffee cup very carefully on the table between us, like he was handling something fragile that might break. He said, "David, that's her voice. I'm not going to insult you by pretending that it's not. I knew Sarah for 12 years. I'd recognize that voice anywhere, but there's no way anyone has recordings of Sarah like this. Not that are this clear, this recent sounding, the audio quality, the acoustics, it's like it was recorded yesterday. Where would they have gotten them? Who would do this to you?" I didn't have an answer. I just shook my head and felt the room start to tilt around me. Felt something fundamental shifting in my understanding of what was possible and what wasn't. On Saturday, my apartment started doing things that apartments don't normally do. Physical things. Real things that weren't just in my head, or some manifestation of my grief. The lights in the hallway outside my door kept flickering on and off, cycling through on off in this strange pattern that had no electrical explanation. I checked the bulbs. They were fine. I checked the connections in the outlet. Fine. I asked my neighbour if she was experiencing anything similar and she said no. Her lights were steady all week. The radiator in my bedroom started making noises at night. Strange clanking and hissing sounds that woke me up at 2 a.m. Sounds like something was being heated and cooled and heated again. Like the whole system was going haywire. When I called the landlord on Sunday morning, He had no explanation, said he'd send maintenance, but maintenance never came, and the following Tuesday I still hadn't seen anyone. Most strangely, my landline, which I barely used anymore, which was mostly just there for emergencies, and the occasional pizza delivery order, started ringing at exactly 3 a.m. both Saturday and Sunday night. 3 a.m., not 2, not 4, 3. Like it was deliberate, like something was choosing that specific time. I didn't answer it. I just lay there in the dark and listened to it ring 10 times, 11 times, 12 times, always stopping at the same count and then silence. Just that sudden silence that felt almost louder than the ringing. On Monday morning I received another voicemail. This one was different in a way I couldn't quite articulate. The voice was still Sarah's, absolutely unmistakably Sarah, but it sounded strained, like she was struggling to stay connected, like the signal was bad or she was far away or something was pulling at her while she tried to speak. David, I can't stay much longer. Things are getting complicated here. You need to start looking into what happened. You need to look at the fire again. Not everything was as it seemed. There are things about that day that didn't add up, things I didn't understand, things that... The message cut off abruptly, not like it had ended naturally, but like it had been interrupted, like someone or something had severed the connection mid-sentence, had reached in and cut off her words before she could finish what she was trying to tell me. And in that moment, sitting in my kitchen on a Monday morning with daylight streaming through the window, I realized that whatever this was, whatever was happening, it was far from over. It was just beginning. This was only the first message. This was only the first sign that something was fundamentally wrong with the world as I understood it. That the boundaries between life and death, between the past and the present, were far more permeable than anyone was willing to admit. The phenomenon escalated quickly after that Monday morning voicemail cut off mid-sentence. By Tuesday evening, I was documenting things systematically, because I had to believe that documentation would somehow make sense of the senselessness, that if I wrote everything down and organised it chronologically, a pattern would emerge that I could understand. I created a spreadsheet which felt absurd even as I was doing it, a grief-addled attempt to impose order on something that defied every rational framework I'd built my life around. Voicemail received, time, duration, number, content, apartment anomalies, location, time, duration, possible explanations, phone calls, dates, times, ring counts, outcomes, electrical disturbances, water pressure variations, temperature fluctuations. It filled up quickly, too quickly. The more I documented, the more there was to document, like the apartment itself was responding to my attention, like something was escalating its activity in direct proportion to my growing awareness. By Wednesday morning, things had moved beyond voicemails and electrical malfunctions. I woke up to find that every photograph of Sarah in my apartment had been turned face down, not broken, not damaged, just carefully, deliberately turned around so I couldn't see her face. I had maybe a dozen photos scattered through my living space. A framed shot from our honeymoon in the bedroom showing us in front of that fountain in Barcelona, both of us laughing like we knew something about forever. A candid photo on the kitchen counter where she was laughing mid-bite of something, her eyes crinkled at the corners. A professional headshot from her environmental consulting firm on my desk, where she looked serious and focused. Every single one was flipped, turned to face the wall or the furniture, systematically arranged as if by someone or something that knew exactly where they all were. My hands were shaking as I turned them back, and I couldn't decide what terrified me more. The possibility that someone had been in my apartment, had moved through my personal space touching my things while I slept, or the possibility that I'd done it myself and forgotten, that my mind was fracturing in ways I couldn't control, that I was acting in my sleep or in fugue states and couldn't account for my own actions. I called the police non-emergency line again and reported a potential break-in. I told the officer that I might have done it myself, that I wasn't sure, that my memory was unreliable. The officer listened sympathetically and suggested I call my therapist, and I understood what she was really saying without her having to spell it out. She was suggesting I was crazy. She was right to suggest it. I probably was. By Thursday, the landline started ringing continuously, not just at 3 a.m, but throughout the day, persistent and demanding and impossible to ignore. I stopped answering it. I just let it ring and ring and ring until it stopped, and then 5 minutes later it would start again with mechanical precision, like a clock counting down to something. My hands developed a tremor from the stress of anticipating those rings, from the constant state of alert that permeated every waking moment. My neighbour came by to ask what was going on. if I was okay, if I needed help. She looked genuinely worried, which made it somehow worse because it meant my instability was visible from the outside, that other people could sense something was wrong just by being near me. I told her the phone was B. Roken and I was having it looked at. She didn't believe me. I didn't blame her. She left looking worried, and I could hear her in the hallway talking about how she was concerned about my well-being, and I knew I was becoming the guy people worried about. The guy in the sad apartment who had something wrong with him that no one knew how to fix. On Friday morning, another voicemail came through, this one clearer than the previous ones, like whatever was happening was getting better at transmitting her voice to me, like the barriers between her space and mine were thinning with each message. David, you need to look at the fire report, the original investigation. Don't believe everything they told you. Things were different. Someone didn't want you to look too closely at what happened. Someone had reasons for making sure the fire looked like an accident. Please, you have to trust me. This matters. You matter. I wouldn't be reaching out like this if it didn't matter. Her voice was urgent, almost frantic, and there was something in the background, a sound I couldn't quite identify, like wind or static or something that might have been another voice, calling out to her, pulling at her. That message jolted something loose in me, snapped me into a different mode. Because this wasn't about grief anymore, or at least I could pretend it wasn't. This was about investigation. This was about finding answers. This was something I knew how to do because I'd spent my entire career as a journalist looking into things that didn't add up. Finding the threads and pulling them until the whole story unraveled. I could do this. I could be useful in this pursuit even if I was losing my mind. Maybe I was losing my mind precisely because there was something real to find, something that had been buried for 13 years, something that Sarah was desperately trying to communicate to me from wherever she was communicating from. The thought of it pulled me up and out of the paralysis that had gripped me for days. I went to the city archives on Friday afternoon, aware that I probably looked like a disaster. I hadn't shaved in 5 days. My clothes were wrinkled. I'd worn the same shirt 2 days in a row. The librarian, a woman named Patricia with reading glasses on a chain, helped me locate the fire investigation report from March 2011. She didn't ask why I needed it. Didn't give me that concerned look that I'd been getting from everyone else for the past week. Probably because she dealt with people chasing the past every single day, and she'd learned not to judge them for it. She just showed me to the microfiche reader and helped me locate the files, patient and efficient and kind in the way librarians can be. I sat there for 4 hours, slowly reading through the official investigation documentation, the technical reports about the electrical failure, the structural analysis of the house, the photographs of the burned-out structure that had been my home. I had to stop several times because the images were too much, because seeing that destruction, seeing the place where Sarah had died rendered in photographs, made it all real again in a way that 13 years of grief hadn't quite managed. The investigation had concluded, as I'd always been told, that an electrical fault in the master bedroom wall had caused the fire. The wiring was pre-1980, deteriorated, and a short circuit had ignited the insulation around the wires. Spontaneous ignition in an enclosed space. The fire had spread rapidly, consuming the front sections of the house. Sarah had apparently been in the master bedroom when the fire started, and she'd become disoriented by the smoke and had been unable to escape. The autopsy confirmed death by asphyxiation. The case was closed. Accident. No foul play. No indication of anything suspicious. But I started reading more carefully. I started looking at the details that the report mentioned almost in passing. The electrical panel showed signs of tampering. The investigator noted this, but concluded it was probably just previous homeowners doing amateur work. The fire pattern was consistent with electrical failure, but the burn patterns in the bedroom were unusual, the investigator had written, suggesting possible accelerant, but no accelerant was detected in the testing, so this was considered anomalous but not conclusive. There was a note in the margins, handwritten by the investigator, that said, "Recommend further testing but family request closure. Medical examiner cleared." No reason to continue investigation. Someone had pushed to close the investigation. Someone had requested that it end despite these anomalies, and I had agreed to that. I had been so broken by grief that when the fire marshal told me the case was closed and there was no indication of foul play, I just accepted it. I'd wanted it to be an accident. An accident is something you can't blame yourself for. An accident is something that just happens. But if it wasn't an accident, if someone had deliberately... I printed out the full report, every page, and I left the archives with my hands shaking and my heart racing, and the terrible understanding that I hadn't investigated Sarah's death at all. I'd just collapsed under the weight of it, and let other people tell me what had happened. I'd never questioned it. I'd never dug deeper. And now, 13 years later, Sarah was apparently trying to tell me that I'd made a mistake. That evening, I started making phone calls. I tracked down the original fire investigator, a man named Robert Hayes, who'd since retired. His wife told me he was living in a seniors community outside the city, and she gave me his number reluctantly, like she was breaking some kind of rule by providing it. I called, and he answered on the third ring, and his voice immediately brought back memories of sitting in a fire marshal's office, devastated and barely functional, listening to him explain how the fire had started. I asked him about the anomalies, about the electrical panel tampering, about the burn patterns, about the recommendation for further testing. There was a long silence on the other end of the phone, and I could hear him breathing, could sense him weighing his words carefully, trying to decide what he could say and what he couldn't. Then he said, "Mr. Chen, I remember your case very well. I'm sorry to hear you're still dealing with this. The investigation was thorough. The conclusions were solid. But you recommended further testing," I said, and I could hear the accusation in my own voice, the anger that had been building for days. "In your notes, you recommended additional testing. Why didn't you pursue it?" Another long silence, longer this time, and I thought maybe he'd hung up already. But then he spoke again, his voice lower, more careful. "The family wanted closure. You wanted closure. It was clear from the electrical analysis that the fire started in the electrical system. We found nothing to indicate anything else." "Nothing to indicate anything else? Or nothing you were allowed to find?" I asked. "Who pushed to close the investigation? Who gave the order to stop investigating?" He hung up on me without another word, just disconnected the call completely, cutting off the line, refusing to continue the conversation. And that silence, that empty phone line after his voice had been there, told me more than anything he could have said. And I sat there holding my phone, understanding that something had been hidden, that someone had made sure the investigation didn't go where it was supposed to go, and that Sarah had died under circumstances that weren't as clear as I'd always believed. By Saturday morning, I had a name. It took some digging through old news archives and property records, hours spent on government databases and land registry websites, but I found it. The house we'd owned together had been purchased with help from Sarah's family, specifically from her uncle Victor, who'd co-signed on the mortgage, who'd been a silent investor in the property, who'd put in maybe $30,000 to help us with the down payment. Uncle Victor, who I'd met maybe twice at family functions, a man I knew almost nothing about, a man who'd never particularly cared for Sarah as far as I could tell, who barely acknowledged her at family gatherings, who seemed uncomfortable around her. I pulled up his name in the property database and discovered something interesting that made my pulse spike. 3 months before the fire, the house's insurance policy had been increased significantly. The coverage had been doubled from its original amount, which was unusual because there'd been no renovation work or improvements, nothing that would justify increasing the payout. The change had been requested by the lender, by the bank that held the mortgage, and I dug deeper to find out why, following threads through bureaucratic websites and historical records. That required calling people, leaving messages, eventually getting someone at the bank's historical records department who was willing to look into something that had happened 13 years ago, a woman named Susan, who didn't seem to care much about the bank's privacy policies. The reason given for the insurance increase was updated property valuation and risk assessment. Nothing specific, nothing that made particular sense. But the adjusted policy meant that if something happened to the house, the payout would have been substantial, enough to cover the mortgage, enough to cover the lender's interest, and enough to leave money left over for whoever held the insurance claims authority, $300,000. I saw the number written in black and white on the document, and something in my stomach went cold. 300,000 was a lot of money. 300,000 was enough to motivate someone. I looked at the policyholder. It was jointly held by me and Sarah, but the beneficiary listed was not me, not Sarah's parents, not any family member. It was a company, a numbered corporation registered in the city. I spent 3 hours trying to find out who owned that corporation, and eventually hit a wall of legal shell companies and registered agents who wouldn't divulge information, which only confirmed that someone didn't want to be easily traced. I called Marcus, my old friend who'd worked with Sarah at the environmental consulting firm. I asked him if he'd ever heard of Uncle Victor, if he knew anything about Sarah's family relationships, if Sarah had ever mentioned anything unusual about her uncle or her family situation. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, thinking back through years of conversations, and then he said something I wasn't expecting. He said, "David, Sarah mentioned her uncle once. She said something about him asking for money, something about him being mixed up in some kind of business deal. She said it to me privately. She seemed uncomfortable about it, worried actually, and I just remembered because Sarah was always so private about family stuff, so careful not to burden people with her problems. But that was years before the fire. I didn't think anything of it at the time. I just thought it was normal family drama. Years before the fire, the timeline was stretching back, the roots going deeper than I'd realised, creating a pattern that had been there all along if I'd just known how to look for it. I started calling Sarah's family members, her parents, her siblings, trying to piece together what Uncle Victor's story was, what his situation had been, why he'd needed money so desperately. Her mother told me that Victor had been involved in some real estate dealings that had gone bad, that he'd lost money on several projects, that he was always borrowing from family members and then disappearing for months at a time, coming back when he needed money again. Her father said Victor had legal problems once, but didn't want to elaborate, said it was family business and better left alone. Her brother said he didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to dredge up old family drama, didn't seem interested in helping me piece this together. By Sunday afternoon, I'd pulled together enough fragments of information to understand the outline of something, though I couldn't quite see the complete picture. Uncle Victor had needed money. He'd co-signed on Sarah's house. He'd somehow arranged for the insurance to be increased without my knowledge. 3 months later, the house had burned down, with Sarah inside, and the case had been closed quickly, without full investigation, without the deeper questions being asked. And now, 13 years later, my dead wife was sending me voicemails telling me that someone hadn't wanted me to look too closely at what happened. That Sunday night, another voicemail came through around midnight. This one was different. This one was Sarah's voice, but strained, frightened, like she was struggling against something, like something was trying to silence her while she was speaking. "David, Victor didn't do this alone. There was someone else. Someone inside the investigation. Someone who made sure it stayed closed. Someone who made sure I stayed buried. But I'm not staying buried. Not anymore. I won't let this go unsolved. Find the connection. Find who paid off the investigator. Find out why no one questioned it. It's all connected. Victor's debts, the insurance policy, the closed investigation. It's all connected, and when you see it, you're going to understand why I'm so desperate to reach you. You're going to understand what's at stake." And the message cut off again, just like before, mid-sentence, like someone or something was pulling her away from the phone, pulling her back into whatever space she was communicating from, leaving me sitting in the dark of my apartment understanding that what I was uncovering was bigger and darker and more complicated than I'd ever imagined. Monday morning came grey and cold, and I realised I hadn't slept in 36 hours. My mind was moving in circles now, following threads that led nowhere and everywhere at the same time. I sat at my kitchen table with coffee going cold in my cup, staring at the files I'd printed out, the notes I'd written, the timeline I'd constructed. And I understood something about the messages. I understood that Sarah wasn't just telling me about a cover-up or a conspiracy. She was telling me that she couldn't rest because the truth had been buried. She was telling me that she needed me to find it, to expose it, to let the world know what had really happened in that house on March 14th, 2011. These messages weren't random. They weren't hauntings or hallucinations or any of the explanations I'd been trying to construct. They were Sarah doing what she'd always done, trying to make the world better, trying to uncover the truth, trying to protect people even though she was dead. She was reaching out because I was the only one who could help her. I was the only one who could tell her story. And if I didn't do this, if I didn't pursue it, then what had been done to her would remain hidden forever. On Tuesday morning, I received one final voicemail before everything changed. Sarah's voice was clearer than it had ever been, crystalline and present, and it sounded almost like she was standing right next to me, breathing, alive, real. "David, I need you to understand something. The fire wasn't an accident. Uncle Victor did start it, but he didn't act alone, and the investigator who closed the case, Robert Hayes, he was paid off. He was paid a significant amount of money to stop investigating, to accept the electrical failure explanation, to not look into the insurance policy or the beneficiary corporations. He was paid by someone inside the police department. someone who had reasons for keeping the investigation closed, someone who knew about Victor's debts and the insurance fraud and chose to look the other way. That person is still working, that person is still in a position of authority, that person is still protecting Victor from prosecution. This is bigger than just a fire, David. This is corruption. This is a cyst, RM that protects itself. And I need you to expose it. I need you to be the journalist you were always supposed to be and tell this story. I need you to tell my story. I need you to make sure that someone knows what really happened to me. I need you to do this because it's right and because it's the only way I can truly rest. The voicemail ended, and for a moment there was nothing. Just silence and the sound of my own breathing and the world continuing on around me. And then I understood. The messages weren't going to continue. This was the last one. This was the final communication from whatever space Sarah existed in, from whatever dimension or consciousness or afterlife or psychic echo made it possible for her to reach out to me across the barrier that was supposed to be permanent and absolute. Sarah had told me everything she could tell me, given me everything she could give me, and now it was up to me to finish the work. Now it was up to me to be the person she'd always believed I could be, the person who searched for truth, who demanded answers, who wouldn't accept the official story just because it was convenient and easy and didn't require any effort. The voicemails had served their purpose. They'd woken me up from the 13-year sleep of grief and acceptance. They'd shown me that the world was more complicated and darker and stranger than I'd ever believed possible, that reality wasn't as solid and fixed as I'd been taught. And they'd given me a mission. They'd given me a reason to get out of bed in the morning that wasn't just about surviving another day, wasn't just about continuing to exist in the hollow way I'd been existing. They'd given me purpose. They'd given me back a piece of my life that had been taken from me when Sarah died. I made a decision right then, sitting at my kitchen table, as morning light started to creep through the windows. I was going to find out who in the police department had buried this investigation. I was going to find the records of the payments to Robert Hayes, find out where the money came from and who authorized it. I was going to track down Uncle Victor and find out everything he'd done and why. Find out how deep his involvement went. Find out if he was still out there living his life like nothing had happened, like he hadn't murdered my wife for insurance money and corruption and greed. I was going to piece together this story, and I was going to tell it. I was going to write about it. I was going to make sure that what happened to Sarah wasn't forgotten, wasn't buried under decades of bureaucratic silence and official lies. I was going to make sure that the corruption that had kept this case closed wasn't allowed to continue, that the person inside the police department who'd taken a bribe wasn't allowed to keep working, wasn't allowed to keep protecting murderers. I was going to do what she'd been asking me to do all along. I was going to fight for her. And in that moment, sitting at my kitchen table with cold coffee and terrible news and a mission that suddenly made everything clear, I felt something I hadn't felt in 13 years. I felt alive. I felt like my life had purpose again. I felt like there was something worth getting up for. The voicemails had stopped, and I didn't know if I'd ever hear Sarah's voice again. Didn't know if what I'd experienced was real or a breakdown or something that existed in the space between those two things. But I knew that I had to pursue this. I knew that I had to do this for her, and I knew that whatever came next, whatever I found, whatever truth I uncovered, it was going to change everything. The first person I tracked down was a detective who'd been working with the police department around the time of the fire investigation, a guy named Raymond Martinez who'd since moved into administrative work. I found him listed in an old personnel directory and called the police station, left messages for 3 days before he finally called me back. When he did, his voice was cautious, like he knew before I even spoke that this conversation was going to be complicated. I told him I was investigating the original fire investigation into my wife's death, told him about the anomalies in the report, the recommendation for further testing that had been ignored, the apparent pressure to close the case quickly. There was a long pause, and I could hear him breathing on the other end, could sense him calculating the risks of what he was about to tell me. His breathing changed. I could tell he'd made a decision. Then he said something that changed everything. He said, "Mr. Chen, I can't talk to you officially, but I can tell you that there were questions about that investigation at the time. There were officers who thought something wasn't right. There were concerns raised about how quickly the case got closed and who made the decision to close it. People who pushed for closure when there should have been more investigation. People who seemed to have reasons for wanting the case to disappear. I asked him who made that decision. The person who pushed hardest." Another pause, longer this time, and I could hear him looking over his shoulder metaphorically, could sense him weighing his career against whatever conscience he still possessed. His voice was lower, more careful. He gave me a name, Captain Michael Sutherland, who at that time had been in charge of the Major Investigations Liaison, who'd supposedly been the one who suggested to the fire marshal that the investigation could be concluded without further testing. Sutherland, who'd been at the station that day when Sarah's case came through, who'd apparently had a conversation with the fire marshal about wrapping things up quickly, who'd signed off on the closure without the additional testing despite knowing about the anomalies. Sutherland, who was now retired, living somewhere in the suburbs, still collecting a pension from the department, still presumably living his life like he hadn't helped bury the investigation into my wife's death, like he hadn't taken money to make a murder disappear, like he was just a regular retiree enjoying his comfortable life. I spent the next week digging into Sutherland's financial records, the way I'd learned to do as a journalist, the way I'd always investigated stories, following money through bank statements and tax returns and property records. I found the gaps in his income. I found the deposits that didn't match any recorded departmental income or overtime. I found tax returns that showed income from consulting firms that turned out to be shell companies, when you dug deep enough, numbered corporations registered to addresses that didn't exist, trails that led nowhere and everywhere at the same time. He'd been paid. That much was absolutely clear. Someone had definitely paid him, and he'd definitely taken it, and he'd definitely used that money to buy a vacation property up north and put his kids through private school and retire early at 55 with a lifestyle that couldn't be supported by his police pension alone. The evidence was circumstantial but suggestive, and it pointed towards something that had been covered up for 13 years, while I'd been grieving and accepting and trying to move forward with my life. I started compiling everything into a document, a careful chronology, building the case the way a prosecutor would build it, something I could turn into an article, something I could publish and use to force a reinvestigation, to shine a light on the corruption. I had emails, financial records, timeline documentation, inconsistencies in the original fire report that I'd found in the archives. I had the voice of my dead wife on voicemails telling me to look for this, telling me that the answers were out there waiting to be found. I had everything except one thing. I didn't have the direct connection between Victor and Sutherland, the proof that they knew each other, that they'd been in contact before the fire, that the payment wasn't just coincidence but actual corruption, actual conspiracy, actual premeditation. And without that, without the email or the phone record or the meeting that would prove they'd planned this together, without that crucial piece, it was just speculation, just implications, just circumstantial evidence and patterns that might mean something or might be coincidence. It was just the kind of journalism that gets you sued, that destroys your credibility, that makes you look obsessed and unstable and paranoid, the kind of story that newspapers won't publish and that ends careers, not because it's untrue but because it's unprovable. I needed something concrete. I needed the proof that would hold up in court and in print and in the court of public opinion. The evidence had to be indisputable, had to be documented in a way that couldn't be dismissed or ignored or explained away through legal manoeuvring. And the only place I knew to look was in the spaces Sarah had been telling me to look in all along. The voicemails had been directing me toward truth, but they'd also been showing me that there was more at stake than just finding out what happened. They'd been showing me that Sarah was still present somehow, still fighting, still refusing to let this be buried, still connected to me across the boundary between life and death, in ways that shouldn't be possible but apparently were. And if I could access that, if I could understand what she was trying to communicate through whatever mechanism made the communication possible, maybe I could find what I needed. Maybe she could show me where the evidence was hidden, where Sutherland had kept the records of his corruption, the proof of his involvement with Victor. So on the night of the 1-month anniversary of the first voicemail, on a night that had felt significant and heavy with meaning, I did something I'd read about but never believed, something that seemed ridiculous and desperate and exactly what someone who was completely losing their mind would try. I sat in my apartment in the dark with nothing but a single candle burning in the middle of my living room, and I called out to her. I said her name, Sarah. Just her name, over and over, speaking it into the darkness like an incantation, like a prayer, like I was trying to open a door that had been sealed for 13 years. I asked her to show me what I needed to see. I asked her to guide me toward the evidence. I told her I believed her, that I trusted her completely, that I was following the path she'd laid out and I needed her help to finish it. I sat there for 2 hours doing this, feeling absurd and terrified and absolutely certain that I'd completely lost my grip on reality, that I'd crossed over into genuine mental illness, that anyone watching me sit alone in the dark talking to a dead woman would immediately recommend psychiatric hospitalization. Nothing happened. No sounds, no manifestations, no whispers from beyond the veil, no supernatural evidence that anything I was doing made any sense beyond the functioning of my fractured mind. And then, around midnight, the moment when the world seemed to thin between day and night, every single photograph of Sarah in my apartment turned face down, again, all at once, simultaneously, like someone had moved through the space instantly, like reality had bent for just a moment to show me that something impossible was absolutely possible. The wedding photo, the family portrait from 5 years before the fire, the candid shot from her work, the professional headshot, all of them, every single one turned in unison as if by a collective force. My heart rate spiked, my blood pressure shot up, my hands started shaking and I couldn't control the trembling. And then my phone buzzed. Not a call, not a text message, not any of the normal ways my phone usually communicated. But the voicemail app notification, a notification that I had a new voicemail waiting for me. But that shouldn't have been possible. That shouldn't have been able to happen. The voicemails had stopped. Sarah had said they would stop. The final message had been clear and decisive and seemed to close off that form of communication permanently. But here it was, a new message. I played the voicemail with trembling fingers, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. Sarah's voice came through, layered somehow, like multiple versions of her voice speaking simultaneously, creating a chorus that was both beautiful and disturbing. It sounded like something that existed in multiple states at once, something outside the normal boundaries of existence. "David, I need you to look at Sutherland's home computer. He kept records, old records, things he couldn't destroy because he couldn't face destroying them, because part of him needed to keep the evidence, needed to document what he'd done, things that would prove everything. The connection is there. Victor and Michael. They go back years, to a real estate deal that went bad, to money that disappeared, to a decision they made together to cover their tracks, to make the evidence disappear, to arrange for the investigation to be shut down. I can't access the computer myself. I can't cross into the physical world the way I used to. But you can. You have to. The evidence is there, and it's the only thing that will make this real for everyone else. The only thing that will prove this wasn't an accident, that someone murdered me for money and corruption and greed. Without it, you have nothing but circumstantial evidence and my voice, which no one will believe, which people will dismiss as the product of a broken mind." The message ended, cutting off mid-breath like something was pulling her away, like the connection between our two worlds was fragile and temporary and couldn't be sustained for too long. And I sat there with a candle burning and all photographs face down, understanding absolutely that I was being asked to do something illegal, to break into a former police captain's house and access his private files. And I understood I was going to do it anyway because the person I used to be, the one who'd accepted grief and accident, was dead and gone. Someone new had emerged, someone who would violate every rule and social contract if it meant bringing truth into the light, if it meant making sure the people who murdered my wife faced justice. So I planned it the way I would have planned any investigation when I was a journalist, with precision and attention to detail and clear acceptance of the risks I was taking. Sutherland lived in a house in the northwest suburb, a nice place and a nice neighbourhood with mature trees and quiet streets, and the kind of anonymity that suburban neighbourhoods provide. The kind of place where neighbours didn't know each other and no one paid attention to cars parked on the street or people moving between houses. I drove past it multiple times over 3 days, noting the security system, noting that it looked old and probably not actively monitored, noting when he left for his morning walk around 7, and when his wife went to her book club on Tuesday evenings, and when there was a clear window of vulnerability where the house would be empty and quiet and available. It was a Tuesday evening in late March when I made my move, when the weather was still cool enough that Pearl weren't outside much when the darkness came early and completely. The sun was setting. The street was empty. Neighbours were inside their homes. I had a small toolkit that I'd borrowed from a friend and a flashlight, and absolutely no idea what I was doing but the certainty that I had to do it anyway. The absolute knowledge that this was the only way forward, the only way to get the proof I needed. I approached the house from the side, keeping to the shadows, aware that I was committing a crime, aware that cameras might be recording, aware that this could destroy my life if it went wrong. The back patio was set back from the neighbour's sight lines. I broke the lock on his back patio door, working carefully, trying to minimise damage even as I was committing a felony. Let myself in. Moved through his house like a ghost, like I'd become something other than human, something that existed in the spaces between law and chaos, something that could move through the world unobserved and unrecorded. The house was dark. I used my flashlight with my hand over it to minimise the light. His study was upstairs, third door on the left, exactly where Sarah had said it would be, and the knowledge that Sarah had known where it was had guided me to the right place, sent chills down my spine. The door was closed. I opened it quietly, and there it was. His computer was sitting on the desk exactly where Sarah had said it would be, positioned to face the window, positioned to overlook the backyard. I sat in his chair, the chair where he'd apparently spent hours documenting his corruption, and I opened the computer, hands shaking, expecting security, expecting passwords, expecting encryption, but finding none. The computer was on. I didn't have to crack anything. He'd left it running, left it accessible, left it open to his files like he wanted someone to find them, like part of him wanted the truth to come out. I started searching through his files, looked in the obvious places first, documents, downloads, his email client, and there it was, a folder labelled V, Insurance, with documents dating back 15 years. Emails between Sutherland and Victor discussing a real estate development deal that had gone wrong, millions of dollars invested in a development project that had failed, Victor desperate and drowning in debt and making a decision to solve his problem through fraud and murder, a series of emails discussing Sarah's house, the insurance policy increase, the decision to increase coverage without my knowledge, the careful planning of how to make it look like an accident, how to arrange for the investigation to conclude quickly, and finally, the money. A wire transfer initiated the day after the fire, $350,000, transferred to an account in Sutherland's name from a corporation registered to Victor's brother. $350,000 in exchange for closing an investigation early, for making sure the case got labelled an accident and filed away forever, for burying the truth. I photographed everything with my phone using the camera app, every email, every document, every piece of evidence, making sure each one was clear and legible and would hold up in court. And then I left the house exactly as I'd found it, carefully, methodically, closed the door behind me, drove away in the darkness, and let the weight of what I'd done settle on me like concrete, like I was slowly being buried under the consequences of my own actions. I was breaking down when I got home, not crying exactly, but emotional collapse that made it hard to breathe, hard to think. I'd committed burglary. I'd violated someone's privacy. I'd crossed lines that journalism taught me were sacred, that could destroy my career and result in criminal prosecution. But I'd also found the proof. I had the documentation right there in my phone, photographs of emails and documents that showed beyond any doubt that Sarah's death wasn't an accident, that it had been murder in service of debt and corruption and greed, that the investigation had been deliberately buried by someone who was being paid to make it disappear. And for that proof, for that evidence, I'd do it all again without hesitation. The phone call started the next morning while I was still trying to sleep, still trying to process, still trying to figure out how to move forward. First from Captain Sutherland himself, his voice furious and controlled in a way that was more terrifying than screaming, telling me he knew I'd broken into his house and that he was going to press charges for burglary and breaking and entering, that I'd made a terrible mistake and I was going to regret it. Then from his lawyer, a woman who sounded like she'd been hired specifically to threaten people, threatening lawsuits, threatening criminal prosecution, threatening everything. And then something strange happened that I should have expected but didn't. The city called me. The police department called me. A lawyer representing the department told me that there would be no prosecution of me for the burglary if I agreed to keep the matter private, if I didn't make the documents public. They offered me money, $50,000 to sign an NDA and drop whatever investigation I was conducting, to walk away and let this die quietly. It was exactly what Sarah's messages had predicted. It was exactly what I expected but still found shocking. It was the system protecting itself, offering me a way out if I would just agree to stay silent, if I would just accept the payoff and go away. I hung up on them without saying anything else. I contacted the Crown Prosecutor's office. I sent copies of the documents to every major news outlet in the province, sent them to the national news outlets as well, made sure the evidence was distributed widely enough that it couldn't be suppressed. I held a press conference on the steps of the courthouse and told the world what had happened to my wife, what had been done to cover it up, what corruption had protected the man responsible, what had kept a murder investigation closed for 13 years. By that evening, Captain Sutherland was arrested and charged. By the next week, Victor was arrested as well, arrested for first-degree murder, for insurance fraud, for conspiracy. And the city launched an independent investigation into how a police officer had been complicit in covering up a homicide. The trial lasted 3 months. During that time, I gave my testimony in open court, told the story of the voicemails to a jury that seemed skeptical, until I explained that the content of those messages was independently verified by the documents I'd recovered, until I made it clear that whether Sarah had actually been communicating, or whether my mind had been directing me toward the truth, didn't matter because the evidence I'd found was real and concrete and damning. I explained the investigation I'd conducted, walked through the evidence piece by piece, showed the photographs of the emails and documents. Victor's lawyer, a man named Donaldson who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, tried to argue that the evidence I'd obtained illegally should be inadmissible, that the break-in had been a violation of his client's rights, that the evidence was fruit of the poison tree. But the court ruled that the physical evidence discovered as a result of that illegal access was still valid because the discovery of real evidence, real crime, superseded the manner in which it had been obtained. The judge said something about justice requiring that genuine evidence not be suppressed simply because of technical violations, and I understood in that moment that Ara had known this, that she'd been willing to ask me to commit a crime because she understood that justice sometimes requires crossing lines, that truth sometimes requires sacrifices. Victor was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole eligibility for 25 years. Sutherland was convicted of criminal conspiracy and corruption and sentenced to 12 years, his reputation destroyed, his pension revoked, his life dismantled. The city paid out a settlement to Sarah's family, $500,000 that meant nothing in any real sense, that couldn't bring her back or undo what had been done, but that had to be offered anyway as some kind of acknowledgement of wrongdoing, as recognition that systems had failed her, that justice had been incomplete for 13 years. I donated the entire settlement to a victims advocacy organisation that worked with families who'd lost loved ones to unsolved crimes. When the trial was over and the convictions were final, and the world had moved on to the next crisis, the next scandal, the next tragedy, when the media lost interest and everyone moved on with their lives, I sat in my apartment and waited for something. I waited for the voicemails to resume, waited for Sarah to say something else, to acknowledge that her mission was complete, that she could rest now, that she could be at peace finally. But no messages came, no voices on my phone, no photographs turning face down, no sounds in the dark, no supernatural manifestations of any kind. She was gone, truly gone, and the communication that had existed between our two worlds had closed forever. The bridge between life and death had been rebuilt and sealed and locked. What remained was silence and the understanding that I'd spent the last month living in a place that most people never visit, a place where the living and the dead could reach across boundaries, where grief and determination and absolute refusal to accept injustice had created something that shouldn't exist but did. I'd started this entire experience as a broken man, someone who'd been utterly destroyed by loss, someone who was slowly disappearing into the fog of grief, who was losing his grip on reality and his will to continue. And I'd ended it as someone different, someone who'd been remade by purpose, who'd been driven by a force that was larger than myself, who'd been willing to violate every rule and cross every line to make sure that the truth was known, to make sure that Sarah's death meant something. Sarah had done that to me, or I'd done it to myself, and her voice was just the externalization of my own deep need for justice, my own visceral refusal to let her death mean nothing, my own determination to be the person she'd always believed I could be. I don't know which interpretation is true. I still don't know. I don't know if she was really communicating from somewhere beyond death, from some other plane of existence, or if my mind had fractured in exactly the right way to drive me toward the truth, or if the answer was something that existed in the space between those two possibilities, something that doesn't have a name in the language we use to describe reality, something that exists outside the categories we've created to understand the world. What I know is that she's gone now. The voicemails have stopped completely. The supernatural manifestations have ended. The connection between our worlds has been severed, and I'm left with the physical evidence of what happened, the convictions of 2 men, the knowledge that Sarah's death meant something, that her murder was uncovered and justice was served, that I was the person who made that happen. Sometimes I sit in my apartment in the evening, and I look at the photographs of her, all of them turned back around so I can see her face again, see her smiling, see the life she had and the future she was supposed to have. And I tell her about my day, about the work I'm doing at the Victims Advocacy Organisation, about the people I'm helping, about the families who've lost loved ones to solved crimes. I tell her about the changes I'm trying to make, the systems I'm trying to reform, the ways I'm trying to make sure that other families don't have to wait 13 years for justice. I don't hear her voice anymore. I don't expect to. I'm not waiting for it. But I feel her presence sometimes. I feel a sense that somewhere in whatever comes after life, she's aware of what was accomplished, that she's at rest now, that she can finally be at peace. The work we did together, separated by the barrier between life and death but still connected through love and need, an absolute refusal to let justice be buried, that work mattered. It changed things. It made a difference. That's all I need. That's enough for me to continue living, to continue fighting, to continue trying to make the world a place where truth matters, and justice isn't just an ideal, but a practice, where the voices of the dead are heard and the guilty are held accountable. That's enough.